Welcome to the final section of this conference, obviously the most important. So just a quick run through of what we've been through in the past couple of days, right? So we started yesterday talking about the importance, the relevance, the challenges of Vos Estis Lux Mundi. Then we went on to talking about the challenges to collaborate, to report and to work with civil institutions. This morning we spoke about the same theme of reporting, but reporting to church authorities this time. And now we're coming to a conclusion talking about the importance and the centrality of support to victims and survivors. I wanted to thank you, first of all, and on behalf of everyone for participating. It was really nice seeing the casual and interesting conversations which happened in the foyer and in the coffee breaks, and we really think that that is an added value to these type of conferences. Just before we start the session in the afternoon, we have a bit of a message from someone special. Can I invite Ursula to come and share it, please, with everyone? Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Very, very quickly, this morning I went to the general audience with Pope Francis and had the opportunity to tell him that we were here and working really hard. And he sent a message of grateful thanks to all of us for our work. He says it's an enduring challenge for the church across the world, and that he was so grateful that we were here and working so diligently. And his message to me was, yours is such important work protecting those little ones from harm, and he wanted me to express his gratitude to all of you for all the work you're doing.
Thank you, Ursula, for sharing such a lovely message, for bragging that you met the Pope this morning. None of us are jealous. Jokes apart. Now we move on to the final session, as I was saying before, talking about support to victims. I have the pleasure and the honor to introduce Fr Larry Yévenes, who is the director of the e-learning certificate in psychospiritual accompaniment at the Alberto Hurtado University in Santiago de Chile. He is also the member of the advisory committee for the prevention of sexual abuse and accompaniment of victims at the National Conference of Chilean Bishops. He's also the member of the Center for the Protection of Abuses and Reparation of the Society of Jesus in Chile. Fr Larry?
Hello to everyone. I want to start this presentation expressing my gratitude to the committee that organizes this conference and sent me an invitation to be part of it. It's a great honor, it's a pleasure to deliver this keynote in front of all of you. I prepared a full text that will be available for all of you. In this presentation, I will highlight some of the main topics I cover in that paper. When I was preparing my notes, an image came to my mind, a kaleidoscopic figure, multiple pieces setting up a variety of shapes, destinies, stories, hopes, frustrations, all of them coming together. We are all aware that there is no such a reality as one standard case of abuse. Each personal damage is quite different. I want to offer to you some ideas on how we accompany those who have suffered abuse within our communities. My intention is to trigger a professional sharing about our way of proceeding when we accompany victims of sexual abuses in canonical processes, in therapy, in spiritual direction, or as members of the same faith community. Many ideas might be shared on this subject matter. I have to select 3 topics that I see as more urgent in the practice of helping relations. Considering this limit, I organized my presentation in 3 parts. First, some therapeutical approaches that all of us need to consider once in a while. Second, some pastoral dimensions connected with the type of situations that we try to assist with our best resources. Finally, I will share some challenges that I see present in our daily efforts. All of them are knots to be tied off. First, psychological dimensions. Words are never neutral. The words victim and survivor are widely debated among us. Some specialists dislike the word survivor for the very same reasons that others find the word helpful. For instance, some authors contend that the word survivor is an euphemism that obscures the reality of the pain and the role of the victim in the whole process. For the same very reasons, other victims say, I may get better, but I'll never get over it. I was a victim then, and I'm a victim now. In other words, when the abuse ends, the person continues to be victimized psychologically, physically, spiritually, intellectually, and socially. Time alone does not heal all the wounds of the abuse. My understanding of the issue is the following. The concept victims implies a self-perception of the damage suffered by the person, the limits of her resources, and, in many situations, her incompetence to direct her own life. From this standing, the person is prone to interpret her problems as consequences of the abuse rather than as difficulties of life that she must and she can overcome. On the other hand, recognizing herself as a survivor here and now presumes to consider that having been victim of abuse in the past does not mean that she is condemned to suffer its effects for the rest of her life. Therefore, distinguishing the abuse from its effects contributes to circumscribe the damage and highlights an image of progressive capacity to heal. In other words, recognizing herself as a victim in the past and as a survivor in the present are complementary dimensions that overlap within the same process, and both perspectives may share the same space. Second, allowing and processing anger. Victims normally have many unresolved feelings concerning the abuse. The challenge at hand has to do with the intense rage and bitterness that the victims seems to feel towards those who abuse them or those who have not supported them. Anger, fury, rage are emotions that are difficult to accept and getting in touch with. Some victims reject these emotions as not applying to them. They attempt to deny and dissimulate their feelings. However, the more they reject them, the more they play a part in their unconscious motivation and behavior. Second, it is key to help persons to recognize the difference between experiencing an emotion and acting out that emotion. At this point, the victim grows in awareness of her feelings and then chooses how to react. Somehow, our role as helper is to allow victims to express their anger until they become exhausted and the feeling wanes. Victims will feel tired, but relieved. At the same time, they will learn how to express anger in presence of others when they are not in our offices. A distinction coming from the world of Christian ethics may be helpful for our task. Anger may be an appropriate and legitimate feeling towards abusers and abuses. Victims have all the right to express their impotence through some form of emotional outburst. A very important problem arises when the person thinks and acts out of vicious anger. Yet, our inclination to anger when provoked by all sorts of abuses is a central feature of our innate emotional repertoire, that is, our alert response to avoid future damage. Second, the victim, the abuser sometimes includes those church representatives who did not respond at the same moment, those who did not want to see the painful reality, or those who did not assign the right label to what was happening only a few meters from their own doors. We are also targeted by those angry reactions. It is part of the price we have to pay due to our misleading actions and our negligent attitude as Catholic Church. Of course, our defensive reactions do not help the victims liberate their emotions. A reparative expression of anger does not exclude the notion that the abuser punishment must be corrective and rehabilitating rather than simply destructive. There are ambiguous feelings in the victims. They feel hurt, but they also feel attached to the abuser. More than immobilizing the victim in her anger, the sanctions against the abuser are not a distraction for that victim, rather, the beginning of her rehabilitation and restoration in dignity. By the way, victims normally distinguish between better than us that anger moved by love and justice is far different from evil hatred, which desire the complete eradication of the object. Third, the power of defense mechanism and repression. In a holistic analysis of our role, we need to consider the hidden and pervasive influence of repression, one of the most utilized defense mechanisms within and outside our faith communities. The very nature of repression shows us that sometimes the only signal in an abused individual are vague images present in their dialogues or bodily sensations that the person does not come to fully understand or interpret. Sometimes the only signal the person verbalizes is the fear to enter a parish, building, or a worship space. What happened there in the past? It is a veil that is gradually uncovered. A lesson that we have learned is that because of the severity of the trauma suffered in abuse situations, an equally severe coping mechanism tends to be employed by children, adolescents, and vulnerable adults. The ability to dissociate is a God-given gift to the child and is reported by many victims. In fact, dissociation can take a number of forms, from numbing, a process by which the person experiences a no real feeling, to out-of-body experiences in which the victim feels as she has left her body and floated to another place. Thus, the person avoids experiencing the trauma. One personality suffers the abuse. Another holds the rage. Another becomes the innocent child, while still another becomes seductive. In either case, victims who use dissociation as a coping mechanism usually feel and fear that they are crazy somehow. Helping them to see that dissociation is a God's gift that keeps them from going crazy is a powerful step towards healing. Minimization is another mechanism. Here, the internal dynamism allows the victim to diminish either the effects of the abuse, the amount of abuse, or the reason behind the abuse. This typically codependent trait gives the victim a chance at not having to face the power of the entire situation. It is a way of shutting down emotions and denying the total impact of the abuse. Victims say, "It only happened once. He just fondled me." In some ways, minimization is more powerful than dissociation because the dissociation comes a worry about being crazy that can serve as an impetus to enter in therapy and work on the painful issues of sexual abuse. Minimization keeps the pain controlled and allows the person to function on a day-to-day basis. This defense against pain works very well sometimes. Only when it breaks down does the victim usually face the pain. Breaking through minimization takes time, trust, and courage for the individual willingly to experience the pain. Repression is the ultimate coping mechanism to deny the abuse that occurred. In this case, the victim has no memory of the traumatic incidents. However, the effects of the abuse linger in symptomatology that reveals mood disorders, personality disorder, or chronic physical problems that are related to the abuse or the stress of the repressed material. While the mind has the ability to successfully repress the information that it chooses not to accept, the body does not have the same ability. Often, persons who suffer abuse do not remember the traumatic event, and suddenly they find out that they were wrong. Finally, some healthier sublimation activities could be humor, art, music, religiosity, and helping others. It is no wonder that many members of helping professions or of volunteers in associations that defend victims are abused children who now find sense in life helping others to cope with the horror. I remember a victim who offered to install an artwork in the high school where he was abused as a means to represent the safeguarding commitment of all of us. Coping mechanisms do not make victims healthy, but they do allow victims to live day by day creatively, clinging to a semblance of normalcy. A very touching issue. Confronting the abuser? Question mark. The experts differ on the importance of confronting the abuser and breaking the conspiracy of silence with other family or community members. The positive outcomes of disclosing or confronting may be including confirmation that the abuse did occur, or stopping a perpetrator from hurting another child or vulnerable adult, support from others, an apology from the perpetrator, and strengthen the victim's decision to say, stop it. The negative outcomes of confrontation may be revenge, loss of family, loss of community support, being called crazy or a liar, and denial. Our role may be helping the victim to ascertain that she has to gain or lose confronting the abuser and whether she is healthy enough to lose other family members' support. We also need to share our determination that deciding not to confront is not a crime, and there is no negative prognosis if the decision is made from a position of strength. In my opinion, we also need to remember, previous to our interventions, that there are many cases when the abuser has died. In some of those cases, the victim may wish to disclose the abuse to the rest of the family. However, family members have a strong interest in maintaining their family image. For those reasons, the preparation for and the decision to break the silence has to be done very carefully, even if only one person is to be confronted. Victims have found that letter writing, grave visitations, and role-playings can help to attain the confrontation and resolution the person desires. A short consideration on the stages in a recovery process. Some strategies and attitude that we need to apply as helpers. First, a communication framework that allows the abuse experience to be integrated. The abuser's intention are to isolate the victim in a well-kept secret. The first role of the secret is self-protection, based on the victim's fear to be rejected, blamed, or questioned. The only fact that the helper believes the person and embodies an acceptance attitude is by itself very therapeutical, beyond how dispersed, confusing, and ambiguous are the stories and the speeches. The second role of the secret is the person believes that she has to protect her listener. In other words, the victim feels that the helper, you, me, will not be able to tolerate the emotional weight of her story. In response, our attitude must be a disposition to listen the most terrible aspect of an abuse and at the same time to convey the conviction that she is always free to decide what context she needs to share, what context she is willing to share, or considers convenient to share. B, a containment and elaboration of feelings associated to abuse. Normally, the abusive experience is associated with painful and intense feelings of anguish, shame, guilt, fear, distrust, sadness, and anger. One of our tasks as helper is to offer a safe space that allows to recognize and to validate those emotions and to facilitate a regulated expression of them. A person who feels freedom in front of us. C, identifying the survival strategies and overcoming the effects of the abuse. It implies the identification of the effort made by the person trying to overcome the damage caused by the abuse and the efforts to regain control over her life. In this stage, the goal is to help the person to get in contact with her own resources in order to face the current difficulties and recognizing herself as a survivor. This step is related to the protective factors present within the person and in her context. Being able to mention the self-protective effort in terms of behavior and psychological resources is a factor that contributes to regain her dignity and self-respect. Pastoral learnings. When I was writing this presentation, a victim sent a short email to me. She didn't know that I was coming to Rome. She said, "All kind of abuse is painful. It causes a scar. But the spiritual one may kill your faith. It leaves you with no God." It is hard to listen to this kind of spiritual damage. In the last year, the authors have described how the emotion towards the abuser may be transferred to God, and the person may feel abandoned, impotent, angry in the relationship with the higher power in which she has deposited all her hopes. When physical and emotional boundaries are violated by a trusted adult, the child develops a lack of trust in others. This lack of trust may also extend to God, the ultimate parent. A very conflictive issue: forgiveness and forgetting. A very conflicted and debated issue may be the victim's impossibility of forgiving the abuser, what might be lived with intense guilt and intensified by the impunity of the abuser, his null disposition to acknowledge the damage, and his lack of acts of reparation. One big problem of the paradigm of the repentant sinner, usually in some Christian spaces, is that this paradigm places its primary focus on the spiritual reform of the perpetrator, rather than on the harm done to victims and their need to healing. In fact, telling a victim that she just needs to forgive and forget may be both insulting and asking for an impossible. We all know that it's not that easy for a victim to forgive the abuser and move on. This fails because the traumatized victim rarely has control over her negative feelings. In a Christian ethic perspective, the abuser has no right to demand forgiveness. But the victim may try to forgive, at least trying to regain some goodwill towards the abuser. This is why when victims want to participate in a restorative justice workshop, are in no way required to forgive in advance their offenders. Restorative justice can only take place if the abuser already admits his guilt and wants to take responsibility for his crimes. The problem with the forgive and forget principle is that it has been misused and wrongly interpreted. Forgiving means to give up resentment or give up the desire to punish. Forgiveness, I quote, is not letting the abuser off the hook or accepting or minimizing the abusive behavior. It is letting go of the rage so that the pain does not continue to determine the future. Forget is an even more difficult word and reality. To forget means literally to fail to recall or remember. To forget an event at will is almost impossible. The act of willing to forget will cause the person to remember. In addition, the act of forgetting that becomes denial and then repression is usually seen as a defense mechanism and, in fact, is unhealthy. Perhaps we need to change the phrase to remit and omit. The word remit means forgive, but it also means to refrain from exacting payment and to submit for judgment or action to someone whose business is to look after such things. Omit means to leave out. In this word, we see the conscious ability that is missing in forget. I quote, "The victim therefore does not need to forget, but rather consciously to omit the information of pain from determining her future." In other words, the victim may feel goodwill for her abuser while still continue to resent his criminal acts. Second, a spiritual component, grace. Victims to whom we intend to help need to be aware of the graces they are receiving: friend, spouse, family support, job, career success may be seen as loving gifts in the person's life. When a victim is in the middle of the storm and pain does not subside, grace usually is not recognized unless the pain is accepted. Darkness continues, and the pilgrimage does not lead to grace as a life-giving experience. One example is the importance of the community support. When a person opens up her story of abuse with her closest friends, they become real and visible blessings for her. Third, their and our prayer life. Prayer helps victims who are facing their feelings of being isolated or alone. Prayer and God offer an experience of protection that reduces fear. Prayer invokes a higher power, a sense of abandonment, and a feeling of love and safety. With our help, the person, through meditation and reflection, might be able to recognize new potentially abusive situations and learn to affirm that she does not deserve to be mistreated, that she can and will avoid abusive situations. Our prayer is also involved in these helping relationships. The dialogues with one victim somehow drain our own physical and emotional energy. We need to pray for each of them and for ourselves. Some of the victims ask us to pray for them, and we should always welcome those requests. More than enough, we need to offer others alienated from their faith and mistrusting God a new place where to share those feelings. They experience the absence of God, and at the same time, they long for God. In our helping relations, when the level of confidence and trust is high, it can be appropriate to invite the victim to join the prayers of her friends and beloved ones. Timing is critical. The victim needs to feel hopeful that progress in the transcendental level is possible. My final topic, challenges for the present and the future. It contains some of the ideas we have been sharing in this conference. The last part of my presentation will focus on urgent topics that victims are demanding from us when we sincerely try to help them during the time they present their allegations in our offices and when the canonical process is already installed. First question, an institutional recognition. With honesty and shame, we need to recognize that some apologies by church authority seems to be insincere, superficial, or half-hearted. Many of those texts begin by saying that church leaders are sorry that a member of their diocese or religious order hurt someone. Immediately, the statement attempts to minimize the author's responsibility. Therefore, as an apostolic body formed to serve the poor and the outcast, the institutional church must recognize their mistakes, promoting action of acknowledging and recognition of victims. Guaranteeing the non-repetition of the crime clearly encourages the healing of victims of clerical abuse by knowing that a similar offense will not reoccur. Survivors also want to be assured that church authority will no longer ignore warning signs of abuse, fail to implement norms adopted to provide safe places to children, or delay reporting credible accusations to the criminal justice system. One important step is to have a mechanism in place that will hold as accountable bishops, major superiors, and lay officials involved. What are the victims demanding us? First, to put all our efforts in destroying the culture of silence in which you live. It's an institutional silence which seems to be directed to take care of the reputation of the church and the well-being of the abusers. As Pope Francis wrote, I quote, "The never again to the culture of abuse, as long as to cover up system that allows it to perpetuate, demands working together in order to create a culture of safeguarding that may permeate our forms of relationships, praying, thinking, living, and authority. Victims, their families, and communities' expectations demand this entirely different approach. This implies reviewing sometimes our hyper-production of protocols, workshops, webinars, disregarding the urgency of binding rules for church authorities and leaders of our dioceses and religious congregations. In this topic, Pope Francis' recent letters, como una madre amorevole and vos estic lux mundi, and the reform of Book 6 of Canon Law provide us with long-awaited sanctions for the negligent responses of ecclesial authorities. Adult women, silent women, abused in the church. In the case of abuse suffered by women, the analysis must start with the issue of subordination and the role of women in the church. In most of the Western society, we are just beginning to realize that women are considered means for the ends of others, and the situation gets even worse when those others are institutions that hold power over the entire life of their members, as in the case of our church. Issues like the structural and dominant role of men in an androcentric patriarchal society are matters to be examined and faced with an authentic prophetic will. The victimology of this subject is complex. However, shocking as it may seem, we have to recognize that many actions considered as form of sexual violence against women occur in our working place and pastoral settings. For instance, we all are aware of sexual harassment in our familiar places, inadequate sexual conversation, and desire touching and hugging, sexist tones, and sexist jokes. The usual way the abuser defends himself is minimizing his actions and attributing the effects to the hypersensitivity of the victim. What is clear is that the vulnerability of the victim, when it is present in an asymmetric power position, could be used as a justification by the abuser. The challenge here is to make visible many abusive situations in which the woman is afraid to present a complaint given the pastoral position of the abuser in the community. Many of the female victims are suffering social isolation after the traumatic event occurs. Others are shocked, facing the disbelief among their own relatives, friends, and other community members in congregations, think in the female religious life, or in parishes. Third, a big one, abuse of conscience. There is an urgent need to provide a canonical status to the abuse of conscience as a crime against human dignity. As one author defines, I quote, "Abuse of conscience is the type of abuse of power that damages the conscience as the seat of freedom of judgment and as the place of encounter with God and with ourselves. The abuser, in the name of God, supplants God and decides for the victim. Beyond sexual abuses and serious transgression of physical limits, we are all aware that hierarchical relations, misuse of the vow of obedience, promotion of vocation, or sacramental confessions could be tainted by dynamics where one gives himself the authorization to decide instead of another person. In these cases, the abuse dictates what the abused person has to feel, think, decide, and do. The will of the abuser dictates what is good and what is bad for the person who comes asking an advice or an orientation in crucial moments of her life. Most of the time, there is an implicit or explicit threat in the response provided by the self-defined voice of the common sense. If you want to be okay, you have to obey my recommendations, my orders, my suggestions, etc. Otherwise, there will be consequences like abandonment, end of the relationship, label negatively, public humiliations, all of them within the walls of the Church of Christ. We all know how difficult it is to denounce these abuses given the complexities of the proof and the almost total absence of witnesses. However, victims are real and lives are affecting in front of our eyes. I'm finishing. Fourth, support to families and community. The wound inflicted to the victim has a direct impact on her inner circle. For that reason, it is morally necessary that our action should be directed to the immediate relatives and to the extended family members. The goal of this action must be to provide contention, emotional support to deal with all the guilt, pain, anger, and other feelings that emerge when the abuse comes to effect. In most of our countries, we offer therapeutical support to the victim, but we also need to implement a whole system for her family, which includes mental health intervention, spiritual accompaniment, and the inclusion of the relatives in the symbolic actions of reparation to be determined. The victim community is also a focus where we have to put our best efforts. An intervention on crisis approach shows us that the community where the abuses occurred also needs a resignification process. My experience teaches me that components of this intervention are the meeting of the bishop or the religious superior with the parish council, the information provided to the whole assembly when the canonical investigation starts and ends with an appropriate communication and interpretation of processes results. Another component should be the role of the diocesan committee, expert on abuses, accompanying the community to understand what happened in the profound sense of the expression, signals they saw, and those they didn't correctly interpret as abuses. My last word to you and to many of my colleagues. My last word, I focus on the role of the diocesan and congregational commissions and personnel dealing with the reception of and accompaniment of victims. Often, I meet tired and worried faces in our teams. It is quite difficult to be on the first spot dealing with the crisis. Those dedicated professionals sometimes are considered the enemies of the church or an essential part of the cover-up system of the church. So you may be in one side or on another side, but we always lose in this consideration, depending on who talks. The challenge here is to make visible what is going on in the reality of our close friends and relatives. For this reason, I provide 3 different suggestions for all of you. The first is professional supervision, either individual or in group. We need to do more on this issue because our commissions are tired, as I mentioned. When we work on this issue, we realize that it's impossible not to take an ethical stance against abuse in favor of victims. We are talking about painful transgression that affect the individuals and the environment, family, community for many years. On the other hand, to be in contact with this kind of sufferings is a painful and harsh process, a commitment none except of frustrations, misunderstanding, loneliness, and other difficulties. The impact of the crisis might be focused not only in our professional task, but also in us as human beings who believe in Christ and sincerely fight for the healing of His church as a community of believers. An image taken from the Eastern tradition comes to my mind. Don't try to slay your dragon, learn to ride them. Sometimes the dragon escape from the cave. Anger, your anger, my anger, spiritual darkness, desire to leave our position, isolation. In those moments, we need to encourage to engage our challenges and difficulties and grow through them, to drive our dragons rather than slay them or drive them back into the cave. For instance, it is time to be compassionate and gentle with our own failure and incapacities. 3 elements to consider. First, professional supervision, either individual or in group, that may help us to process the emotional impact in us of the story we accompany, and also to visualize the self-care needs that we have to face and not always are able to put into words. Second, professional sharing with other commissions dealing with similar realities. Third, permanent formation on how to deal with all the angles and nuances of working with survivors and their different realities. Ignatius of Loyola, help us. Love ought to show itself in deeds more than in words. Thank you.